Good evening and welcome. My name is Ramaswamy. I currently work as a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences and Biomedical Engineering at Purdue University in the USA. But I spent my last 10 years working in Bangalore, so I have great affinity to Bangalore. I also want to start by thanking Mr. Ravi Chandra and BIC for allowing us to do this event in this place. I want to thank again Farzan, the Cytecare Cancer Hospital Group, and several others involved in this to do this on behalf of all of us at Ignite Life Sciences Foundation. The idea of Ignite Life Science Foundation, it's new, is to create an independent, self-sustaining body for funding life science research that's both basic and applied in the Indian context. I'll put this in context as to why this is interesting and important and what we're trying to do before I invite the panelists. We just heard that the total funding for science in India is 0.8% or 0.7% of its GDP. And any OECD country on an average spends about 2.7% of its GDP. So the total amount of funding for science in India is very, very small. And I'll put that in context with numbers later. I will add to that by saying that in the most of the Western world, whether it's UK or the US or the other countries, 70% of the 2.4% comes from private funding, philanthropy, or from industry. And in India, the total funding is very small. Even in that funding, only about 25% comes from philanthropy and industry. There is also a lack of very good independent bodies that are accountable, like the Wellcome Trust or the Harvard Hughes, that run good science funding agencies. The Ignite Life Science Foundation is an attempt by us in order to take India from being also a runner-up in the science and technology in India to being a global player. Because we believe that it is science, development in science and technology that's going to change the way we think about the world, and it's going to make India a better place for all of us to live. And therefore, it's important. And it's important that all of us participate in it. And science is not an activity that is done by scientists sitting in their laboratories all alone. Everything that a scientist is and academics do impacts everybody in society as well. So it's the egalitarian idea that it is a crazy person. When you ask children, what do you think of scientists? They say, is this person who's completely crazy, who looks shallow, who has no social skills, becoming a scientist is completely wrong because we will not be able to work on problems relevant to society unless we are also active participants and members of society. So what we are hoping to do today is to enlighten you on the role of science in society. We'll have a lot of time for question and answers, and we will have our panel members coming in. I want to thank Jay and Jogan, who are helping me organize all of this as part of Ignite. Then we have a fantastic group of members who are the board members of Ignite Life Science Foundation. The chair of the board is Professor Jyotsna Dhawan. Pankaj Chandra is a member of the board. So you will hear from them as well. Shahi Jamil, who is a member of the board, is also here. So we have a very illustrious group of academics, entrepreneurs, businessmen, administrators, and scientists who have come together to start this foundation. And the hope is to, with all your help, make Indian science a powerhouse in the world, make it a place, and then use science to make India a better place to live for all of us. With that, I will begin to introduce the people who are going to be on the dais today. I would first like to welcome Venki Ramakrishnan. For those of you, Venki needs absolutely no introduction. Is there anybody in this room who does not know Venki? Put your hands up, then I will do an introduction. Right, so not a single hand went up. So Venki, everybody knows you. So no introduction to you. Please come and take your seat. The second panelist is Professor Jyotsna Dhawan. She's currently a senior scientist in CCMB. I met her sometime around 2007 when she was putting together a proposal to set up an institution in Bangalore, which is very different from other institutes, a collaborative research institute where groups of people come together to solve problems. And it was her idea. She took it through, and the government of India funded it. And I had the great pleasure of being recruited to be the first dean of the place and help Jyotsna create and set up this institute. She is an amazing scientist, very socially conscious, never said no to me for anything. Talking to her for 10 minutes, if you're not inspired, I think the problem is with you. So welcome, Jyotsna. She is also the chairman of the board of directors of the Ignite Life Science Foundation. The third person on the panel is Professor Pankaj Chandra. All of you have questions. So Pankaj has had a very illustrious academic career. He was a professor at IIM Bangalore, and then he was a director of, he was a professor at IIM Ahmedabad, was the director of IIM Bangalore, and currently is a vice chancellor and chairman of the board of Ahmedabad University. You can't talk about science without talking about education, and you can't, and it is university education that funnels people to do good science. If any of you want to know a lot more about the problems of Indian universities, there was some discussion that we were having. Pankaj has written a fantastic book called What Ails Indian Universities. I suggest that you buy in the book and read it, because many of the questions you have about Indian education system and where we are with that will be answered with that book. But he's here. We can also ask him some of those questions if you feel like. What we're going to do today is try and have a panel discussion. None of the speakers are going to speak for very long. The idea is to get as many of you to ask questions, and the questions are about science and society. And before I hand over the mic to the people on the podium to say a few words and ask questions, I want to set some ground rules for everybody about how this question and answer session will work. And I will cut you off if you don't follow those rules. Okay? No question should be more than 30 seconds. So repeat the question to yourself 3 or 4 times before you put up your hand up to ask the question, and see if it's more than 30 seconds. Okay? That way we will have many people who will have the ability to ask questions. And my request to the people on the dais is that please don't take more than 2 minutes to answer a question. That way we can go through many more questions as well. All of you here, because I think you're passionate about education and science. And I want as many of you as possible to have your questions voiced, because these questions, it's not just about the answers that the people in the dais will be able to give, but I might participate in giving. It will be thought-provoking to all the other people who have come together. And this is a journey that if you want to be a great place in science, we at Ignite Life Sciences cannot do it alone. We need all of your help as members of the society. With no further ado, what I'm going to do is to ask Professor Venki Ramakrishnan to say a few words, and then I will go through the other panel members. Thank you. Venki, the floor is yours. You can sit and speak.
So, having a panel on science and society is very broad, and so I'll just tell you make a few comments on why I think science is so important for society in general. Oddly, India is probably the only country where the Constitution says that you must develop a scientific temperament in the country. There's no other constitution in the world that actually specifies a scientific temperament as a goal. So it is a little odd that India spends much less per GDP on science than any of the OECD countries by quite a large margin. 0.7% compared to 2.4%. So it's less than a third, allowing for the GDP. So somehow its actions and its goals aren't clearly aligned, and that's something we need to explore. So the question is, why should societies be interested in science and supporting science? Well, the fundamental thing is science is part of human knowledge. It's as much a part of our culture as anything else, as arts or humanities or literature, music. Science is about the world. It's about how we came to be, how the universe came to be, how things work. So there's an intrinsic curiosity. We're all born scientists, but we stop being scientists as we get older. When we're young, we want to know why the sky is blue, or why people die, or all sorts of fundamental things, how the planets came to be. But then we start taking things for granted, and partly this has to do with the way science is taught. So, but there's another aspect, which is the sort of wealth of nations aspect. If you look at 1700 and looked at the GDPs of various countries, India and China had by far the world's largest GDP. And if you looked at Europe around then, it had a negligible fraction of the world's GDP. Now, Shashi Tharoor was famous for a rather polemic speech he made at Oxford that he then expanded into a book called Inglorious Empire, in which he attributed the wealth of Britain to colonization and exploiting of India's resources. Now, there's no question that Britain made the most of its colonies, but I have to tell you that GDP of China and India probably did not change very much between 1700 and 1900. What actually happened was the GDP of Europe, just 3 countries in Europe alone, France, Germany, and the UK, accounted for a bulk of the world's GDP without really affecting that. In fact, it's their GDP that shot up. Why did their GDP shoot up between 1700 and 1900? And the reason is the Enlightenment in Europe made possible an explosion of knowledge that led to science and then the Industrial Revolution and technology that had a huge impact on the economy of those countries. And interestingly, America took over as the largest country for GDP by around 1908 and dominated much of the 20th century. And today, you can see that China is, with heavy investment in science and technology, is dramatically increasing its share of the world's GDP. And India's GDP is also growing, but not as fast. And that's because its investment in science and technology is much less than that of China's. Another piece of data that you'll like is that you might want to consider about colonization and wealth is that the 3 richest countries in Europe in 1900 were Sweden, Switzerland, and Germany. And they had either 0 colonies or very few colonies. The poorest, 2 of the poorest countries in Western Europe were Spain and Portugal, which had huge colonies, okay? And per capita, Portugal had more colonies than any country in Europe. It was a tiny country and had Brazil and large tracts of Africa and little small pieces of India and so on. And it was one of the poorest countries in Europe. So you have to realize knowledge is the prime source of wealth, much more so than having colonies which essentially provide resources. And even today, if you look at resource-rich places, and you look at countries that are resource-rich and knowledge-poor, for example, Africa or even Russia, they're not doing as well as countries that are knowledge-rich but resource-poor, like Switzerland or Singapore, which have almost no resources, but have huge knowledge-based economies. So science and knowledge are extremely important for the wealth of nations. This also translates to well-being, not just wealth. For example, if you were living around 1700 or even 1800, your life expectancy was no better than if you lived around the time of Buddha or Christ. Okay? Life expectancy had hardly changed over couple of thousand years. But in the last 100 years alone, due to advances in our fundamental understanding of biology, of which then allowed medicine, which previously was very empirical, became a scientific-based discipline. Life expectancy in the last 100 years has doubled, okay, in most countries. And so you can see that it doesn't just affect our wealth, it also affects our health. So I talked about how, we should be proud of science because it's a triumph of human knowledge. Even the idea that we know atoms exist or molecules exist, it's an amazing intellectual feat. So we should be proud of that as human beings, that we've created that. But it's also important for our health. The final thing I'd like to say is science is global. Americans did not care that quantum mechanics was invented in Europe and that Americans hadn't invented it. They simply built on quantum mechanics and took it to the next level. It didn't matter to them. Europeans didn't care that the number system had originated in India and came to them through the Arabs. It's called Arabic notation, but we now know it originated in India. They took on it and they built mathematics on it and advanced their mathematics with it. Today there's some sense that we have to feel that things were invented here, otherwise they're no good. But that's not the case. Science is global. People have always borrowed ideas from all over the world. And when I go to China today, they don't care about where things are invented. They want to sort of go ahead. Now, occasionally they will use Chinese, traditional medicine. For example, artemisinin, which won a Nobel Prize. The Chinese aren't really celebrating, YA2 for her discovery because she came out of nowhere and she was experimenting with Chinese traditional medicine and found this compound that was very effective against malaria. That sort of thing could happen. But ultimately, it's a blend of Western methods of testing and rigor and proving, it was this compound that actually caused the effect. But the compound itself came out of, traditional medicine. Another example is Taxol, which is an anti-cancer drug, which comes out of, bark that was known to, South Americans. And so there is traditional knowledge, but it has to be combined with modern empirical knowledge. And we have to bear in mind that we can't really, there's no such thing as alternative science, or there's no such thing as Indian science or Nazi science or any of that stuff. It's all science. And there's a joke amongst scientists, among modern medicine, is what do you call alternative medicine that works? And the answer is medicine. Because, if it actually works, it just simply gets incorporated into the corpus, of medicine. So those are some somewhat rambling thoughts about science and society, and I'd like to now just turn it over to
Jyotsna.
My fellow panelists.
Any starting comments, Jyotsna, before you launch into questions? We'll ask questions later, but maybe you want to say a few words?
I just want to say that scientists can play an important role on many fronts that are not limited to the generation of new knowledge. And I think, a meeting like this is really important, and I want to thank the BIC for supporting this, because we really need to communicate to the public that serious science takes place in environments which are informal, they are irreverent, they are inclusive, and those are ideals that one would like to work towards. And it's not just about series of successes, but what actually happens is that you build on serial failures. And those are processes which are important for the public to understand, that when you're supporting science, and as we've already talked about, that since most science that is supported is government-funded science, it is the taxpayers who are supporting us, that they are actually supporting us to go through those failures in order to come up with successful new knowledge. And I just want to end with a small quote, which is from a philosopher, I've forgotten his name, Shockwell, I think. He says, the larger the island of wonder, the larger the island of knowledge, the greater the shoreline of wonder. And I think the place of wonder in being able to create new knowledge is something that is very important, and it is something that scientists contribute to every day. So I'll leave it at that for now before we get into questions.
Pankaj?
Thank you. Well, I live the world of 17-year-olds. And in fact, when I was looking at this picture here, I thought maybe I'm moving in that direction. But people surrounding me and the people who are inventing the newness in this world are my students or students of any university who are 17-year-old. And it's a very big question that come to our mind. What does science mean to a 17-year-old? The 17-year-old is aspiring to be a physicist, aspiring to be a biologist, and both. It's also a philosopher or a historian, somebody who's wondering how commerce is going to be done. And it constantly, I wonder, what is the world of science that this 17-year-old is imagining? And unfortunately, our educational institutions in the country are not able to provide that perspective or also that foundation for the 17-year-old to be able to discover. I think we all understand very well what science would mean to a physicist or a biologist. But I think it's very important that those who are not from the world of science engage with science with as much intensity and with as much curiosity as it is for a scientist. And I'll give you an example. We run a global management program in pharmaceutical industry. And there was this question on pricing of drugs. And it turned out that all my economists and my management colleagues were providing ways of answering that question in a very expected way, because that's how we are all trained to do that. So then we got a conversation going before this set of students who are actually working executives between a philosopher on the ethics of the pricing and a biologist to talk about what does it take to put a drug in the market. And it completely changed the nature of conversation, the nature of understanding of what does science try to address, what are risks associated with research in science, why does it take too much, a long gestation period for an outcome to come out, and what is it that the society should value out of it. And at the same point of time, an issue about where is it that this drug is going to be used, who uses it, and what is the ethics associated with it. So to me, this world of science is much, much bigger. And as Professor Ramakrishnan, you mentioned about not only the wealth of nation, but it's about the existence of society in itself. How do we define how we live? What are the philosophical moorings? What are the rules and regulations that the society constructs for us? And I think that, to me, is the essence of the linkage of science and society. And as a university, that's what I think many of us around the country and the world are trying to achieve and bring forth as a platform for the students. Thank you.
Thanks, Pankaj. So now what we're going to do to the question answer session, I think we should have time for questions. I'm going to start with Jyotsna asking one question, Pankaj asking one question, and then we will move on to the audience. So since they are on the dais, they get the first right. So Jyotsna, your turn.
So you talked a bit about collaboration and how important it is in order to for scientific problems to be cracked and for science to progress. So the thing is, though, the means by which collaborations take place can be aided by technology. But how do you think the best collaborations work? What are the ingredients that you need for true understanding between individuals and teams of people towards addressing issues in science.
Okay, so I think there are two kinds of collaborations. One is for very large-scale projects where no individual or individual group can tackle it. And some of them are, for example, the Higgs boson discovery, which involved thousands of scientists, or gravitational waves, also involved many hundreds of scientists. So I think those are examples where you need the scale, you need the large number of people with different expertise to come and tackle a problem. The other kinds of collaborations on smaller scales, which happen much more often, are when two individuals come together who have complementary expertise. So neither has all of the know-how to tackle a problem, but together they can tackle it. For example, a geneticist and a structural biologist might try to understand how some particular gene works. So that's one example. The other example is when two people know each other quite well and think it would be simply fun to work together. That requires, but all collaborations require trust. Either you have to have trust in the organization, like with CERN and the Higgs boson, or even with complementary expertise, you have to have some trust in the other person. They're not going to take your sample and go off and not talk to you again. Or with friends, obviously, that the trust problem isn't there. So it works in some cases. It won't work in every case.
Pankaj?
My question is also related. Your background is in physics and then in biology. and we know that most complex challenges today are not necessarily going to be able to addressed by a single discipline. What's your thought in terms of how do we build this multidisciplinary exploration, exposure in an educational institution at undergraduate level, at graduate level? Both programs are very structured, cut and dry, and that's how rewards are also given.
Yeah.
What might be your message?
So I think it's important not to specialize too early. And this is one area where I think the US system is probably better than either the Indian or the UK system, which are very departmentally based. And so, you have to declare your major right from the start, and your coursework is all very well defined, and you're not allowed to explore outside. And it's even bad that scientists don't take any humanities subjects or vice versa. I think, they should all be as broad as possible until they actually have to start working. And when it comes to research, I think that a good way, you cannot force collaboration between disciplines. If if I'm a biologist and I go to talk to some random physicist, there's going to be nothing in common, really. But sometimes there will be. And the goal of institutions should be to break down barriers so that when collaborations can occur, they can occur without too many problems. And this requires maybe having departments, not far away and isolated, maybe located in the same building, certainly using the same cafeteria or canteen, encouraging cross-disciplinary courses, but also cross-disciplinary lectures, so that people are aware of what the issues are, and so that they make an effort. Just like scientists should reach out to the public, they should also reach out to each other, because, frankly, most physicists don't know what a ribosome is, just like most members of the public don't.
Okay. The question's open, but remember the rules I told you. I will cut you off at 30 seconds. So please ask questions. First question there. No, here, yeah, you. Thank you.
I'm still doing my question in my head.
No. The young lady there, yeah, please.
Hi, so I'll be greedy. I have two questions, please. First one is for Professor Ramakrishnan. Sir, I've been. Was Hitler influenced by Darwinism? I'm reading his autobiography, and I've heard YouTube videos of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. I want to know your opinion on whether Hitler was, influenced by Darwinism, because that's where I cannot argue further with my friends when we're talking about religion and anti-theism. Second question is Professor Pankaj Chandra. Sir, don't you think that religious indoctrination from a young age is already dumbing down the kids? Because all the metaphysical questions, all the existential questions that we have are already sort of answered by whatever religion the child is born into. Thank you so much.
So I would say Hitler did not have a monopoly on the eugenics movement. There were actually many distinguished scientists, including geneticists, very famous geneticists, who were eugenicists. You have to realize it was a time when Europeans felt superior to all other human beings, partly because they were richer than most other human beings. And people who are rich often feel they're superior, it's part of their feeling entitled, So I think that's, so it's not just Hitler, it was a general issue, but I would say it was an abuse of Darwinism. Darwinism simply describes a process by which species differentiate and new species arise. It doesn't say anything about human races, and certainly there was no knowledge of human genetics when either Hitler or the early geneticists were around.
The beauty of the religion is that you can. It's also, you can grow out of it as well. So, and there's so many religions around that you can actually explore, and that's also the beauty of growing up. What can actually accelerate that process of thinking and consequently allow individuals to have an independent view on what they should believe as opposed to what they think they should believe, is the power of education. And I think in our country, if we are able to create that diverse kind of a perspective, that exposure to variety of different ways of thinking, individuals will make their own choices whichever way they go.
Next question. Yes, please.
Yeah. What we're seeing now is that society as a construct is going through immense change. It's going through huge volatility world over. Now, in your view, is the change in society that we're talking about, has that impacted the advancement of science? Is it propelling it faster because of whatever cataclysmic changes we're seeing in society, to an extent that science probably is not in the limelight? A lot of other issues hog the limelight. Or do you see there's an impediment for the advancement of science? And do you see a parallel in history wherein great sweeping changes in society has actually impacted science? Just to elucidate on that point.
Thank you.
Is that for me?
Yes.
Oh,
if they don't spray anything, you're the hero. So
I see. All right. I think that it is true that I personally believe that science flourishes when there's real freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, and minimal interference, ideological interference. For example, the Nazis practically destroyed German science, which was among the best in the world. Germany and Britain, possibly France, were the leading countries scientifically in the world. And German science was effectively destroyed, and most of continental European science as a result of Hitler's ideological influence on science, and this idea of Nazi science and Jewish science, which was all nonsense. And the result was German science took 50 years or more to recover from World War II, to recover its sort of excellence. And similarly, in the Soviet Union, genetics was regarded as a sort of capitalist thing because they didn't like the idea that different people would have different innate abilities. And so genetics was regarded as suspect. And the result was that Soviet biology lagged behind for several decades as a result of interference. Now, an interesting question is China. China is not by any means a country with, freedom of political opinion and so on. It's quite a, top-down country, and yet it's advancing scientifically quite dramatically. And so the question is, can you have pockets where people can say what they want and do what they want about science, but they're not allowed to speak about, the government? So that remains an open question.
Yes, I have a question for Jyotsna, actually, which is a perfect segue from what you just said, Professor Ramakrishnan. You talked about governments and countries interfering in the practice of science and the autonomy of science. I just wondered, as you start up a fledgling funding organization, how you view and will ensure and be vigilant about the autonomy of the science as you're funded by large corporates, and presumably.
So I think the key point of a foundation like Ignite Life Sciences Foundation would be that you have a group of people who are philanthropists and who are willing to support and walk this journey and take the risk of investing their money, supporting the idea of independent science. Now, how that is devolved and how it is actually managed will have to be left to a group of scientists and managers within the foundation and advisors who will take no instruction from the funders. So there has to be a firewall between the funders and the way in which the funds are actually distributed. Now, that's not to say if there's a particular funder who wishes to see that, say, stem cell research is supported or cancer research is supported, or somebody wants to have deep investigations into marine biology, that they should not be able to earmark funds saying, we want this area to be grown, right? But they're not going to tell the Life Science Foundation who they should fund and what that scientist should do. So I think that's a very important issue and must be maintained, because the independence and autonomy has to be, because otherwise you can't guarantee the best science will be funded.
So that's a very good point. And I just wanted to follow up on that by saying that one of the reasons Britain, even for despite its much smaller size, does so well in science is because of something called the Haldane principle, which was introduced around the early 1900s, which says that governments are allowed to set priorities because they're the representatives of the taxpayers. So if they want more money on cancer or aging or, new materials or whatever, they're allowed to set priorities. But what they're not allowed to do is to determine how to go about those priorities, because no one has that knowledge other than the scientists in that field. For example, if you want to eradicate cancer, you can't insist that the work all be clinical, because you may need to understand fundamental biology in order to be able to even tackle various aspects of cancer. So that separation between government and the actual science, infrastructure and science establishment, that's quite important, because it also removes politics from the funding of science.
So I want to just add one thing. As Jyotsna said, I want to re-emphasize what I said in the beginning is the idea of Ignite Life Science Foundation is to provide that independent, trustworthy, and well-managed science funding. And that is the goal of Ignite Life Science Foundation. Yes?
Yeah. Good evening. Thank you for being here and sharing your thoughts with us here. My question is rather simple. Do you think that science has a marketing problem in India? Rather than saying that it's an acquisition of knowledge, had we said that it's a search for truth, probably there would have been much more people forthcoming for that, especially a religious country like India. Do you think that that would be a positioning issue?
I'll ask Venki to answer, and then I want Pankaj as the management guru to answer as well.
I don't know. I think, knowledge and truth are not really distinguishable, and I'm not sure it makes a big difference. I mean, if you look at, the Sanskrit word jnana, which is essentially knowledge, it's very well respected. I think scientists really just need to engage more with the public and point out why science is both exciting and wonderful, but also important for the country. I think that's more important perhaps than maybe the slogan you might use. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm naive about marketing. So.
Pankaj?
Well, I believe in building a brand inside out. And being, the brand has to be very authentic. This messaging has to be very authentic. And perhaps as Indian science starts, and it is already delivering in some corners, but it starts to actually deliver more, which is very valuable to the larger society, I think this perception will vanish over a period of time. What it needs is people who will hold hands over this journey and make sure that this passage is as seamless as it should be. And I think foundations of this kind, the government, yourself, many others can make that happen.
So I just want to say something. I just want to add. I don't think that science or scientists in India suffer from a lack of respect or a lack of, support in some, important ways. So the idea of bringing more people into science is a wonderful one, but that has already happened. That is already happening as our demographics change. And what is very heartening to me as a teacher is the fact that our students are now coming not just from elite colleges and elite schools, but they're coming from everywhere. And they bring a fresh perspective, as well as, the problems of all of the way in which our society is evolving. So I think, I'm not sure that the branding is really an issue.
Shri.
So it seems to me that in society in general, there's some kind of a backlash against things scientific or scientifically derived in favor of things that could be more natural or organic, even though they may not have the soundest scientific base. And I see this often that people look at, if it's a chemical, even though it may have the strongest of logic behind it, it's like if it's more natural, it's definitely better. It's not always the case. Do you think this is a failure in communication? What is really happening? And that's addressed to you, Venki.
I think it is a failure in communication, but it's not restricted to India. We have in Britain a person who's going to become the next king of the country who believes in homeopathy and all sorts of other things. This isn't just true in India, and I think it's people forget. They negative news always makes a bigger impact. So if some new drug has some terrible side effect, that makes bigger news. But what we don't see is the aggregate improvement. Even in the last 50 years, life expectancy has gone up. It's only just now started to plateau off in some countries. So we have to say, look, we are still improving the well-being of humans, on average, and that's because of modern evidence-based medicine, which is to medicine based on science. And so I think this is a failure of our ability, to make people realize what science is about. Science is not about insisting that this particular medicine is good. It's based on evidence. If tomorrow somebody finds a better medicine, they'll abandon the old one, you know, and that's the beauty of science.
Question there, right at the back, yeah.
With the dissemination of gene editing technologies like CRISPR, which are putting it in the hands of people you can't count on to be responsible scientists, and one hears scary stories about how that could change society as we know it. What are the ethical and regulatory frameworks that are emerging to see how we manage something like this?
So, so the Royal Society partnered with the US National Academy of Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and they effectively said, they declared a moratorium on germline editing, which is to say, editing any human cell that can be passed on to offspring, okay? As you know, that moratorium was violated by a Chinese scientist who's now been sentenced to jail, and for editing these 2 children whose father had AIDS, had HIV, you know, HIV infection. And it was a completely inappropriate use of the technology. And there was a huge backlash about how he could get the permission to do these experiments on these children. So the problem is this is a problem that's going to have to involve scientists and society to decide what is an appropriate use of the technology. For example, if you had a terrible genetic disease that would cause a lifetime of suffering, and you could use this to remove the genetic defect and transplant healthy cells inside you, you would say that's a good thing, and most people would. And in fact, if your child had it, you would absolutely want to have your child have that technology. On the other hand, if it's for what you might call enhancement, you know, most people, let's suppose you had future genetics told you if you change these few genes to this particular variant, your child will be better at mathematics. Okay, now I could see a lot of, especially Indian parents, saying, "Oh, that's something my kid should have." Okay, and that's not necessarily a good thing because you don't know what those genes, what other effects those genes might have on health. So I think it's a complicated problem. It has to involve scientists, societies, and it can't involve any one country. It has to be an international agreement. Otherwise, as you say, you can have rogue scientists doing it in some, you know, the country of sort of with the least amount of regulations.
So, you want to add something?
I just want to add that India does have very good guidelines, both for stem cell research as well as for genome editing. The challenge is that even if you have good guidelines, you really depend upon not just a consultative process with society, but also a mechanism to find out and have some punitive effect on people who transgress those guidelines. That is still a challenge.
Here. Oh, you're done? Okay, you asked the same question. Okay.
I have this doubt in my head because I was doing some research into innovation a few years ago, in the ecosystem in India for innovation. And what came up constantly was that as adults, we tell people to go forth, be creative, you know, explore new ideas, new options. But our education system, our cultural system, the way we parent, is actually very intolerant of failure. And you talked just a little while back that as society, if you're investing in science, we're investing in the confidence that failures will one day result in some sort of success. So do you see this changing at all? I mean, and Professor Chandra, with your, when you interact with students, do you see our culture changing towards a tolerance towards failure?
You know, I think the students are less of a problem. In fact, they'll all agree with you, and they'll all agree with me in here. It's really the society around us, the parents. In India, we have a very bimodal distribution when it comes to aspirations of parents. The kid gets an A in any inconsequential subject. The entire community knows, and they think this is the next Einstein in making. If the kid gets a D, there's an instant failure, and I think this kid is doomed. All of us are somewhere in between. And, and I think there's a lot of effort that is needed in terms of, making our parents aware that opportunities are much, many more than what they were before. And there are newer opportunities from new disciplines that are coming. And I don't know where it's stemming from. It's stemming either from anxiety or from employers and others who actually don't reward or don't spend enough time looking at young kids who are very different. Now, when it comes to institutions, I'm not a fan of our regulatory system because that's what is forcing our institutions to behave in a certain manner. But there are lots of experiments actually happening in the country today, more so in the schools than in higher education. I'm actually far more hopeful about schools, high schools in India, and especially in cities. But I think the problem is how do we take all of those experiments in smaller towns, in municipal schools, and elsewhere. And I think there we are completely at a loss of designing mechanisms to be able to identify, support, reward young students and get them to not think about failure, but to think about learning. And that will require milestones of very different kind. I'm sorry for exceeding your 2-minute. You put me onto a very kind of a sore nerve, in here. But I think this centralized system which regulates schools, which tells every school to follow the same curriculum, to write every kid to write the same exam, and then you have 10 lakh kids writing one board exam, is just not going to be able to answer this question of yours for another 100 years. I think we have to let schools run amok, get them to design their curriculum, get them to do their own ways of teaching and learning, and then their kids start to do well. I think the parents and others will understand. And there are many other ways in which we can actually gauge whether the school is coming up to the mark in terms of rigor and other requirements, but not by having these centralized systems of evaluation. And I think we're very far away from it. I'm very dissatisfied and unhappy.
So, the question from right on the back there. Yes, please go ahead.
Hello. For the advancement of science as well as technology in a particular country or a region, I personally believe that one of the important issues is international patenting. Patenting is one of the issues which advances the science and motivates the people to go more and more about engaging into fruitful result of research, which was very much realized in the Western world, in USA and UK much before. And we, being Hindu philosophy in India, we always thought that patenting is never necessary and knowledge is always free. And the same thing was there in China.
Can you come to your question, please? Can you come to your question?
China also. And how should we learn something about patenting from China, if at all they have changed their system by now?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, Pankaj, maybe you know more about China and you've studied China much better.
I don't have an answer, but I think working of a patent is more important than the patent. So
I would agree, yeah.
In my mind, if we can make a mechanism of petty patents or many other ways in which people can quickly get little bit of a proprietary kind of hold on to their innovation, but it gets used and applied by many, I think the society will gain tremendously. And it'll also remain open for many to use.
I also think commercially the value of patents is overvalued.
Overrated, yeah.
It's much more the know-how and how you use the know-how to generate products. People patent often defensively, just to prevent lawsuits or things like that. But in actual fact, I'm not sure how much they help innovation.
Right, I would agree. I think that patenting has its, importance in certain realms. But, when we're talking about basic science and using that as a means to uncover new rules of nature, patenting may be one of the side effects, if you would say, but I don't think it can be the goal.
Question.
Okay. Here I have a question regarding the science education in university. So today in high school, let's say in 11th standard, when the student takes a science maths, and then the natural next thing is to start preparing for JEE and look forward to engineering. Okay. Science comes only as a fallback that if you are not good at engineering or not getting an admission there or whatever, and therefore as a fallback option, get into one of the nearby college doing a BSc and such kind of thing. So my question is basically, how can that kind of a thing be changed to promote science and the rewarding part of the career so that it can also be a useful path for the high school student to enter science in university?
Well, I have to tell you, I flunked the IIT exams, and so I, went into science.
Yeah. So, also, I think the important point is how do we get people who have engaged with science to remain with science and be part of the contribution process. And then I think in whichever way they go.
And I want to say one thing and add to what Professor Venki Ramakrishnan said. The problem is not with the children, it's the problem of the parents. Some of the parents believe that if my kid gets the highest marks, they should go and do engineering, right? So the kid doesn't care. And in fact, if the kid also believes that, they're better off doing engineering than coming to science, because it is the ability to question your parents and go do something else, or the ability to accept failure is important, because 99% of the experiments I do in my lab does not work. And if you're used to succeeding and creating a toy, you're better off doing engineering or medicine than doing science. I think some of us who have done well in science is because we have learned that failure is an important lesson. So
I also just want to add to that, and I think that the other sort of group that has failed is scientists themselves in actually being able to communicate what it is we do in not just to other scientists, so it's like preaching to the choir, but to kids in schools and their parents, and making it so in fact, small groups where you can actually talk to parents and tell people about what it is that you actually do. Much of this also comes from the fact that parents feel that their kids are not going to have a good career if they go do science, right? So you need to...
So the question right at the back.
Thank you for a very interesting conversation. This question is directed to all three panelists. I have an impression, contrary to what you just said, ma'am, that science at its forefront is now getting divorced from society. Because if you were to read the table of contents of the American Journal of Science or any other scientific journal, the subjects that are being discussed are completely beyond the reach of even an averagely educated person, and I would venture people in this audience. The topics in science, because science is growing at such a rapid rate, is exponential. The part of it which I look at is it a failing of the educational system? Is it a failure of synthesis? Is it the inability to communicate? But the fact is, I do not understand the forefronts of science as what I could have done or my father did a generation ago. Thank you.
No, let them answer this question. Is that you want to answer the question or you just want to leave it as a statement? Okay.
I think you have to realize that if a scientist opens the pages of a science journal like Science or Nature, you don't understand anything, even outside your own specialized field, Even in biology, actually, I can't even understand the paper sometimes next to mine, which is supposed to be in the same, broad area. So this has to do with the growth of knowledge and the specialization of knowledge. And one way to counteract it is for scientists to take the time to explain the thing without dumbing it down. You know, in other words, simplifying without dumbing down is a tricky compromise. But, you know, for example, magazines like Scientific American, which I still read, they do a very good job of explaining state-of-the-art science in a way that a general reader can understand. But certainly this is something scientists have to work at.
Sorry,
Do you want to?
next question here. So we have time for 2 more questions. So you're the last one question.
So I have a question directed to all of you. It's just that, we hear about global warming and the rapid rate of extinction annually, and even farmers in India committing suicide. So is society actually going to be the same? Like 30 years from now, is society still going to exist, or are we just all going to be fighting with each other for basic resources like water and even like clean water supply and just a place to live, And I just feel, and this is the first question, one tiny thing too, if that's the case, if society is not going to exist, why is it that we're still not giving enough funds for solving these crises that we started? We were the one who came up with the plastic issue. Yep. We were the one who created climate change.
Got the question. Let's give them an answer.
So I think you've asked 2 very broad and very challenging questions. As far as the fate of the planet is concerned, my personal view, it would do better without all of us. And I think that's the way we seem to be moving, because we seem to have sort of moved ourselves out of existence. The issue, what was the second question? About funding.
Yeah.
See, I don't think there's necessarily such a clear connection between funding for all of these things and the ways in which society develops. I mean, society is messy, right? It's not a linear process by which we can actually progress through these very challenging issues that you raised.
Can I?
Yeah, Venki.
Just so one thing is, natural scientists tend to underestimate the importance of social scientists. A lot of these changes are things like behavior. There's a whole field of behavioral economics, and so we need to sort of be more conscious of people who are doing sociology and psychology and other what are called social sciences, because that can often help change things, and change people's choices and behavior and so on. So there's much more scope so it's not always going to be a technical, engineering or natural science solution.
So I want to answer this, but I'm not going to answer this because we'll have the last question, and then I will answer this in my closing remarks. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Going back to the opening comments from Professor Ramakrishnan, that difference of 0.7% GDP and 2.4%, and the difference that you then refer to in the amount of spending or funding that China does versus India. In your opinions, 3 of you, what are the causes of that vast disparity?
I don't know. I mean, it could just be historical, in that when India became independent, it simply carried on with the level of investment, and somehow as the economy grew, the increase in science spending didn't keep up with the pace of the economy. So as a fraction of GDP, it's still lagging behind. I mean, science funding in India has definitely increased, but maybe not increased proportionately to the GDP. And there is also, as I point, in the private sector funding is really abysmal in India. So private sector investment in R&D is very, very low. It's 25% instead of 70%. So I think the combination of that, if private sector matched the typical 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio of public sector spending, India's, R&D would be, somewhere around, 1.5 or something. Not great, but not terrible. But I think that's part of the problem.
Pankaj, you want to say something?
Yeah. Well, I have 3 hypotheses in here. One is that we as a country and a society carried lots of deficits in terms of societal problems, and I think they just kept getting added up again and up and up and up, and at some point of time, most resources wisely or unwisely go in addressing them, and there's very little left. When actually societies have to get rid of these deficits so that they can allocate more resources to newer challenges that come. Second is, I think Indian industrial growth has also taken place through lack of innovation, through strong government participation and knowing people in the society and the government. And as a result, many have not felt the need to innovate. And the third is, there's a large number of people in our society who believe that they can make money without knowledge. And I think they're going to be actually either be out of business or are going to lose out, or the country will lose out in the very long run. So those are my hypotheses on these ones.
Jyotsna?
So, thank you for that. So I'm going to take a slightly different perspective, and that is that, when I think of, for example, now I'm just restricting myself to the life sciences, but, to some extent this is true of all the sciences. It's still a very small activity, because if you look at the number of institutes where, cutting-edge research is done in India, they are small in number. And those, sort of scientific research has moved away from the universities. So we need to, I think, strengthen our universities and strengthen research at the university level and at the undergraduate level. And then we will potentially also have the capacity to have enough people who are doing science at a level which justifies a much higher level of funding. Having said that, it's not that one should not, start the process of increasing the science budget, but I think that there's also that perspective which needs to be taken into account.
Thank you very much. I'm going to say a few words before we end. I know many more hands went up, and I'm very sorry that we couldn't take all of your questions, but we are limited by time. I want to make a point for you, but I want to end with an answer to that question because from the young lady there, because my generation is somewhat responsible for where we are today. The answer, I have a different take on your question. Indians like to do charity. They don't like to do philanthropy. The philanthropic funding in India is very small because if you see a beggar, you will give them money, right? And you immediately you feel happy that they got food. If you don't think that, oh, the guy is begging, let me give him a job. So there is a difference between philanthropy and charity, and Indians constantly mix up. And charity is instant gratification. Philanthropy is the ability to invest for long term. When you see a hungry man, you can give them a fish or give them a fishing rod. We like to give them a fish. And I think we have to change the attitude for the society, for the long-term good of our own society. And I think that's another problem that we have. But I want to end by answering that young lady's question because it's a conversation that I've been having with my children who are 19 and 22. They ask me the same question, that we are doomed, why are we doing all this, right? Here's my answer. In the 17th century, there was a very famous economist called Malthus. And he predicted that there is so much of cultivable land and the population is increasing, the world population will stabilize at 1 billion. Today we are several billion, and as Professor Ramakrishnan said, in every possible way you can think of, we are better than we were when Malthus made that theory. Okay? We constantly underestimate human ingenuity and our ability to solve problems when we are faced with that. Sometimes we wait for crisis to happen before we solve it. Sometimes we proactively solve it. But always, science problems have been solved because of human ingenuity. And the reason so I'm very hopeful that by human ingenuity, whether it's in social sciences or sciences, it is the ingenuity of us to change behavior, to find new methods in technology that will allow us to preserve not only the world, but also have a better world for you and your children and your grandchildren. And I strongly believe that this is the positive attitude that we need to take in order to be able to take us forward. And the purpose of organizations like Ignite is to therefore fund and create new ways of doing science new ways of doing research, just not in biology, just not in engineering, but also in social sciences, so that as a society, we will solve the problems and be better off than where we are earlier. So that is the motivation that we created Ignite Life Sciences with. So I think that's a good question, and it's very nice you asked it. So thank you all for coming. I want to thank the panelists, Venki for So Venki for coming all the way from UK and taking the time off to spend several hours with us, Professor Jyotsna, Dhawan, and Professor Pankaj, Chandra. I want to thank Fazan and the Cytecare Cancer Hospitals for helping us put this wonderful program together. I want to thank BIC and Mr. Ravichandran for allowing us to use the hall. And thank you all of you for coming. Hopefully you will go back and be excited about what science does. Here's a simple question. All of you ate Pongal and Vada today because today is Makar Sankranti. If go and ask, tell your children, go and ask everybody who said, how is that when I take this Vada fluid atta and put it in a frying pan, the outside becomes crisp and the inside becomes soft. That's where science begins. Thank you very much.